The sheriff's deputy pulled Johnny Cash over on Highway 54 just outside El Paso, Texas, on October 4, 1965. Routine traffic stop. Broken taillight on the Cadillac. Johnny knew what was about to happen. He'd been through this before. The deputy would ask for license and registration, would smell the sweat that came from too many pills and not enough sleep, would ask Johnny to step out of the vehicle. What Johnny didn't expect was what he'd do when the deputy found the guitar case in the back seat, when the deputy opened it without asking permission, when the deputy started going through Johnny's personal belongings looking for probable cause. The confrontation that followed would put Johnny Cash in a jail cell within an hour and force him to choose between compliance and dignity in a situation where the law had all the power and he had none. If you're here for stories about what happens when authority stops pretending to be fair, consider subscribing. This isn't about criminal justice, it's about what power does when nobody's watching.
By October 1965, Johnny Cash's relationship with law enforcement was already complicated. He'd been arrested before, possession charges mostly, amphetamines that kept him awake for days, barbiturates that brought him down, a cycle that had become routine enough that arrests felt like inevitable cost of doing business. But this time was different, not because Johnny was innocent. He had pills in the car, hidden in places he thought were clever, but because of what happened during the stop itself. The deputy who pulled him over was young, mid-20s probably, the kind of cop who'd grown up hearing Johnny Cash on the radio and now had a chance to interact with someone famous. His initial approach was almost starstruck. "Mr. Cash, is that really you?" Johnny had been through this too. Sometimes recognition helped. Sometimes it made things worse, because cops who felt disrespected by celebrity tried twice as hard to assert authority. "Yes, sir, that's me." "License and registration, please." Johnny provided both. The deputy examined them longer than necessary, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this situation. A celebrity, a known drug user, a broken taillight that gave legal pretext for whatever came next. "Mr. Cash, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Can I ask why?" "Just step out of the vehicle, please." That's when things shifted, when the deputy's tone went from starstruck to procedural, when Johnny realized this wasn't going to be a warning and an autograph. Johnny stepped out. The October heat was oppressive even at 3 p.m. The highway stretched empty in both directions, except for the deputy's patrol car with its lights still flashing. "I'm going to search your vehicle. Do I have your consent?" Johnny knew the law well enough by now. "Do you have probable cause?" The deputy's expression hardened. "I smell marijuana. That's probable cause." "There's no marijuana in my car." "Then you won't mind me looking." This was the game. The deputy didn't need to actually smell marijuana, just needed to say he did. And once he said it, refusal to consent became suspicious behavior that justified search anyway. Johnny watched the deputy walk to the Cadillac's trunk, pop it open, start going through luggage and equipment.
The deputy went through everything systematically. Suitcases, guitar cases, the spare tire compartment. Not just looking, dismantling, pulling lining out of suitcases, dumping contents onto the highway shoulder. Johnny's stage clothes, personal belongings, letters from June, photographs of his daughters, everything scattered across the dirt and gravel like trash. "Is this really necessary?" Johnny asked, his voice still controlled but tension creeping in. "I'll determine what's necessary." The deputy found the pills in a shaving kit. Small bottle, maybe 40 tablets, amphetamines, no prescription. "Well, what do we have here?" "Those are for my back. I injured it in—" "You have a prescription?" Johnny didn't answer. They both knew he didn't. The deputy's demeanor changed completely. The starstruck fan was gone. Now there was just a law enforcement officer who'd found contraband and had all the power in this situation. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "Come on, we can—" Turn around, now. Johnny complied, felt the handcuffs tighten around his wrists, metal too tight, deliberately so. You're under arrest for possession of controlled substances. But here's where it got worse. The deputy didn't just arrest Johnny, he made him stand there, handcuffed on the highway shoulder, while he continued searching. 15 more minutes going through every remaining item, opening Johnny's wallet, pulling out cash and counting it slowly, reading personal letters aloud. Have you ever been completely powerless while someone violated your dignity just because they could? Have you watched authority become cruelty because nobody was watching them? Drop a comment if this feels familiar. Johnny stood there, sweat running down his back in the Texas heat, hands cuffed behind him, watching this deputy perform a show of dominance that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with power. When a truck drove past, slowing to look at the scene, the deputy waved cheerfully. "Got Johnny Cash here, found his drugs," announcing it, making sure passing drivers knew, turning an arrest into entertainment. That's when Johnny said the thing that made everything worse. "You're enjoying this." The deputy stopped, looked at Johnny with an expression that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't far from it. "What did you say?" "I said you're enjoying this, making me stand here in handcuffs while you go through my personal belongings, announcing it to people driving by. This stopped being about drugs 10 minutes ago." The deputy walked over slowly, stood close enough that Johnny could smell coffee on his breath. "You think being famous means you don't get treated like every other criminal? I think being a cop doesn't give you the right to humiliate people." Wrong answer.
The deputy grabbed Johnny's arm, the one already twisted behind his back in handcuffs, and yanked it upward. Pain shot through Johnny's shoulder. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Cash. Right now, you're nobody. You're just another junkie I pulled over on the highway. And if you keep running your mouth, this gets a lot worse for you." Johnny's instinct was to fight back. He'd been in enough bar fights and prison yards to know how. But he also knew that resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, those charges would bury him in ways possession wouldn't. So he did something harder than fighting. He stood there and took it. "Yes, sir," Johnny said, voice flat. "That's better." The deputy released his arm. "Now you're going to stand here quietly while I finish my search, and if I hear another word out of you, I'll add resisting arrest to your charges. We clear?" "Yes, sir." The deputy took another 10 minutes, not because he was still searching, because he could, because making Johnny Cash stand on the highway shoulder in handcuffs while cars slowed to look was its own form of punishment. Finally, the deputy loaded Johnny into the back of the patrol car, didn't protect his head getting in, let it bang against the door frame, slammed the door hard enough to make Johnny wince. The drive to the El Paso County Jail took 25 minutes. The deputy never spoke, just looked at Johnny in the rear-view mirror occasionally with an expression that said, "I won." If what happened here bothers you, if you recognize the abuse that hides behind legal authority, hit that subscribe button. This story doesn't get easier.
Processing at El Paso County Jail was routine humiliation, strip search, cavity search, delousing spray, even though Johnny clearly didn't need it. Every procedure performed with just enough roughness to remind him he had no power here. Every command delivered in that tone cops use with people they've decided deserve contempt. Johnny was fingerprinted, photographed, his belongings inventoried and confiscated. The booking officer made a point of mentioning he was a fan, said it with the kind of irony that made clear he was a fan of Johnny's music, not Johnny the person standing in front of him like every other junkie who got arrested on drug charges. "Shame what you've become," the booking officer said while filling out forms. "Had talent, threw it away for pills." Johnny didn't respond, had learned by now that anything he said would be used as evidence that he was difficult, disrespectful, deserving of whatever treatment he received.
They put him in a holding cell with 6 other men, drunk driving arrests mostly, one guy who'd been in a fight. All of them recognized Johnny Cash immediately. None of them said anything. Jail has its own etiquette. You don't ask questions, you don't make conversation, you just exist in the same space and pretend everyone's invisible. Johnny sat on the metal bench and waited for his phone call, waited to contact June, waited for lawyers to handle bail, waited for this to become just another arrest story that would be newspaper entertainment for people who loved watching famous people fail. Hours passed, 4, then 6. No phone call was offered. When Johnny finally asked, the officer at the desk said he'd get to it when he had time. Punishment through bureaucracy, through making the famous person wait like everyone else, except longer, because making him wait was its own satisfaction. June finally posted bail at 11 p.m., 8 hours after the initial traffic stop. 8 hours of Johnny Cash sitting in a holding cell thinking about power, about humiliation, about what happens when authority is given to people who use it to hurt.
The charges were eventually reduced. Possession, minor offense, fine and probation, nothing that would seriously impact Johnny's career. But the arrest report was public record. The story made papers across the country. Johnny Cash arrested on drug charges in Texas. What didn't make the papers was how the arrest actually happened. The extended search, the deliberate humiliation, the deputy's enjoyment of having power over someone famous. Johnny never talked about it publicly. When reporters asked, he'd say, "I was arrested for possession, I paid the fine, I'm moving on." But privately, to June, to close friends, he'd talk about what it felt like to be completely powerless, to have your dignity stripped by someone who could do it legally, to understand that law enforcement wasn't about justice, it was about power, and power corrupted even people who started with good intentions. Years later, that experience would inform how Johnny talked about criminal justice, about police accountability, about the difference between enforcing law and enforcing cruelty. "You can do terrible things to people legally," he'd say in a 1972 interview. "Doesn't make them right, just makes them legal." If this story changed how you think about authority and accountability, drop a like and comment, have you witnessed or experienced abuse of power by law enforcement? How did it change you?
This wasn't just about a traffic stop or a drug arrest or pills hidden in a shaving kit. It was about what happens when authority is given to people who use it to dominate rather than protect. When the law becomes a tool for humiliation rather than justice. When power corrupts not through dramatic abuse, but through small, legal cruelties nobody can challenge. Johnny Cash stood on that highway shoulder in handcuffs, watching a deputy violate his dignity, and learned something about the criminal justice system that no prison performance had taught him. That the cruelty isn't always illegal. Sometimes it's just policy. Sometimes it's procedure. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction on an officer's face while he makes someone wait, makes someone stand in the heat, makes someone feel powerless because he can. Thanks for watching. If this story matters, subscribe. Share it with someone who's experienced the gap between how law enforcement is supposed to work and how it actually works. And remember, legal doesn't mean just. Authority doesn't mean accountability. And sometimes the worst abuses are the ones nobody can prosecute.